Good evening, y'all. My name is Cale Carter, and today we're going to be continuing our historical examination of the 364th Infantry Regiment. Now, the last video I did covered the Phoenix Massacre, which was the historical event that ultimately marked the 364th as a troubled unit. Now, today's video is going to be a video on a subject that some of y'all may be really curious about, and that is the 364th's history at Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi. Now, the 364th Infantry first arrived at Camp Van Dorn between May 26th and May 27th, 1943. And one of the interesting things to point out about the 364th during this time frame is that the 364th, when it arrived in Arizona, was comprised primarily of southern black soldiers that came from the South, whereas when the 364th came to Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi, a lot of the soldiers that made up the newer batch of recruits came from northern states and northern cities. So almost immediately when the 364th arrives, a series of incidences occur, and some of those events are I would make the argument unfairly attributed to the 364th, but in some cases they're directly connected. So the first core event happens literally the night that the remaining of the 364th arrived, which was on May 27th. So on the night of May 27th, a group of black soldiers entered one of the black service clubs on Camp Van Dorn carrying alcohol, which technically was not allowed in the service clubs. Now, a hostess asked them to leave, and the soldiers refused, and they pretty much stayed an hour after closing. Now, even though some of the soldiers weren't a part of the 364th, a sergeant of the 364th later identified some of the core soldiers that were in that incident being a part of the 364th. And in fact, in some records, you have cases where some of the soldiers were saying, yeah, we're that outfit that came from Phoenix. You heard about Phoenix, what we done in Phoenix, have you? So there ends up being, in some of the records, it comes off as the 364th being antagonistic from the onset. But in other records, they try to make mention that while, yes, the 364th might have had some soldiers involved, there were other black units that were stationed at Camp Van Dorn too. So therefore, they weren't just the only unit that was involved. So the very next day, on May 28th, on May 28th, a group of soldiers go to the post exchange. And the post exchange officer felt that the soldiers were being a little too noisy. So he shuts down the post exchange. And a crowd ultimately formed, and the crowd of black soldiers formed. They started throwing beer bottles at the post exchange. And ultimately they ended up forcing themselves in, and this is my favorite term right here, they liberated some merchandise. Now, in terms of how much the merchandise they liberated, some will say about $800 worth, but they came in and wreaked havoc. So that was day 2. The very next day, on March 29th, a group of approximately 75 soldiers. Now, the records say approximately 75, but given the fact that some of the records came from the townspeople, it could be an exaggeration. It could have been a lot less. It could have been anywhere between 40 and 50. There's really no clarification, but according to the records, they say approximately 75 soldiers. Approximately 75 soldiers from the 364th marched into Centerville, Mississippi. And the interesting thing about it is that the townsfolk complained that when the soldiers marched into town, they were shouting obscenities. Cussing people out, and one of the more interesting ones, which actually came from one of the townspeople, and actually comes from one of the exchanges in the book, one of the books called The Slaughter, one of the townsfolk recalled that the black soldiers said they wanted some white poop hanging.
What?
Censor some of that word right there. But ultimately, when that occurred, the soldiers pretty much returned to base after that without any incident. Now, the very next day, May 30th, this is where the core of what occurs starts. So, on May 30th, the military policemen from Camp Van Dorn stopped a group of black soldiers from the 364th for a routine spot check and a spot check of uniforms and passes. Because of course, if back then if you was on leave, MPs could basically subjugate you to a random uniform check. Now, historically, black soldiers from a lot of units felt a certain way about spot checks because spot checks came off as ways to just randomly check soldiers and harass black soldiers. But I digress. That's just kind of extra historical context. So, one of the soldiers, Private William Walker from A Company of the 364th, he refused to button a sleeve. Now, there was really no explanation as to like why he refused. Like, it's possible that he could have been missing a button from one of his uniforms and he just couldn't button it. But either way, what occurs next is kind of not complete. It's not really completely clear. So, the MP who checked him, he prepares to get out his Jeep and he starts reaching for his nightstick. Now, according to reports, Private Walker sees him reaching for his nightstick and begins to lunge at him and get into a scuffle with him. And according to some sources, they said that Private Walker was trying to fight to reach for his sidearm. Now, the interesting thing about this is that while this is going on, the MP who was also on patrol with the MP that got into the confrontation with Private Walker was very slow in reacting. The MP did not really react to what was going on beside him. So, meanwhile, while this is occurring, 3 local sheriffs see what's going on and they witness the struggle between Private Walker and the MP. And Private Walker sees the local sheriffs coming towards him, so he jumps out the Jeep, and from there, again, there's really no clarity as to what exactly happened. Did Private Walker get out the Jeep and started attempting to run away? Was it a confrontation with the local sheriff? There really isn't any clarification as to what exactly happened. But according to the sheriff, which we have to take with a grain of salt, like with most of the things that's going on, the sheriff sees Private Walker get out the Jeep. He swears on the stand that he told Private Walker to stop, basically to stop, or he will shoot. And also, there was really no clarification as to if Private Walker was armed, did he manage to take the MP sidearm, or was he just basically trying to escape the scene. But either way, the sheriff shot him. And after the sheriff shot him, soldiers basically grab Private Walker, they bring him back to the post, and ultimately, they bring him back to Camp Van Dorn, and ultimately he dies. So, once again, word and rumors about what happened gets back to camp. And the soldiers start hearing word that, man, this guy killed one of our guys, and X, Y, and Z. So soldiers begin to gather and almost immediately begin to try to attempt to secure weapons. Now, ironically, Company C's supply sergeant, which was Technician 4th Grade Watkins, he refused to surrender the keys to the armory despite the fact that soldiers from Company C who were already upset about what happened were physically assaulting him, verbally assaulting him, but he refused to relinquish the keys to him. So because he refused to relinquish the keys, that resulted in him getting assaulted. But that also led to the soldiers having to try to break into the supply room and acquire some M1s and even a Browning automatic rifle. So, ironically, for his actions and refusing to relinquish the keys, Technician 4th Grade Watkins was awarded the Soldier's Medal, and the reason why was because they felt that in him refusing to relinquish the keys, he actually helped save some lives, which is pretty much true given the fact that they had to go around him and try to break into the supply room to take weapons out of the racks. So, while Company C was having their issues, the Provost Marshal of Camp Van Dorn sent a detachment of black MPs down to the post exchange, thinking that black MPs would help quell the growing situation that was also occurring at the post exchange. Now, sadly, he didn't know about what happened in Phoenix the previous year and how the black soldiers felt about black MPs. And in fact, there was reports that when the soldiers saw the black MPs come and say, oh, here they go again. They try to do it like Phoenix all over again. And this led to basically clashes between the black soldiers and the black MPs. Some of the soldiers even attempted to try to rush the MPs for their weapons, but this ultimately led to fire breaking out. And when some of the fire broke out, a Private Raymond Johnson, who apparently was an innocent bystander, got shot in the leg. Now, ultimately he survived, but meanwhile, while all this is going on, the commanding officer, which was Colonel Goodman at this point, he moves to try to control the situation. So, along with the regimental chaplain, which was Captain Gibson, they went to the post exchange, talking to the men and moving among them to try to defuse the situation. And ultimately, he gave orders to the battalion commanders, hey, go ahead to gather the men, talk to them, let them voice their complaints, and let's try to address them. But please make sure that they don't go into town and do what they did in Phoenix. So, ultimately, that works. That works, and ultimately, no other major incidences occur that night. Now, this incident leads to yet another investigation, which I will have to cover in a separate video because it's pretty interesting how that investigation was conducted and everything else. Now, the last major documented incident that occurred at Camp Van Dorn occurred right on before the 4th of July. Now, for the 4th of July, the Black Service Club wanted to host a dance for the black soldiers. And the planned dance was supposed to include 200 black women who were from the local area to basically come and dance with the soldiers. There is one problem, though. There's about 8,000 black soldiers. There's over 8,000 black soldiers at Camp Van Dorn. So you combine that with the fact that the dance was well advertised before it, and that led to a large group of black soldiers arriving to the dance and getting upset because there was 8,000 of them, or a lot of black soldiers, but there was very few black women to dance with. So that led to a fear that this was going to trigger an event. So the MPs were arrived, and they were warned that, hey, trouble may be breaking out. So they arrived on station. Now, in addition, the field officer of the day at Camp Van Dorn felt the MPs weren't going to be enough to handle this situation. So he ordered a battalion from the 99th Infantry Division to, in essence, be ready to get involved if something was to break out. Now, according to official reports, the soldiers ultimately dispersed without incident, and in fact, Captain Gibson, who was the regimental chaplain, wrote in his diary, he basically says, quote, "I'm proud of this to state that none of our men were directly involved in the affair." So, even though that event is mentioned with regards to the 364th, there was also other black regiments and other black units that was on the post, so it's highly possible that those were soldiers from quartermaster battalions and quartermaster companies as well, and even engineering companies, engineering regiments as well. So in this part of the video, this is where I start going into the alleged Camp Van Dorn massacre. Now, according to The Slaughter, and according to the book The Slaughter by Carol Case, as well as people who make mention of this event, the alleged massacre of the 364th takes place immediately after the July 3rd incident. And during this point, and again, that's according to the book, both veterans and locals make mention that after the July 3rd incident, white MPs and soldiers who were frustrated with the fact of how the 364th conducted themselves in comparison to other black units, especially since they arrived, decided to kill unarmed black soldiers as retribution. Now, again, the number of victims vary, but according to the book The Slaughter, as well as individual testimony, sometimes the numbers can range anywhere from 500 up to 1,200 being killed. And on the high end, 1,200, that would roughly account for a third of the regiment's strength. And as for what happened after the massacre, after the alleged massacre, the bodies of the soldiers were allegedly buried on a remote part of the camp, and ultimately the entire incident was covered up. Now, for those that may be watching this, they say, well, Kel, why you keep saying alleged? And the reason why I say alleged is for a few reasons. One, while it's not uncommon for killings of black soldiers to take place during this time frame, a killing of over 1,200 soldiers is very difficult to hide, even if the army wants to. And the reason why I say it's difficult to hide, and in fact, while the locals make mention of a lot of black soldiers getting killed, a lot of the black veterans who are from the 364th make mention that if there was a massacre of that size, they would have known about it. With that being stated, however, one of the soldiers does make an interesting point, and the soldier's name is Malcolm Laplace. He makes mention that when he was with the 364th, the commanding officer, when he would serve as the secretary for the commanding officer, when black soldiers would turn up dead, initially they'll be listed as killed, but then he would go back and say, well, change them to AWOL. And according to Malcolm Laplace, this occurred for approximately anywhere between 20 to 30 soldiers. Now, what is my theory on this? So, do I think that a massacre of 1,200 black soldiers occurred at Camp Van Dorn? With current records and current history that we have available, no. And the reason why I say this is because I reviewed both the U.S. Army records, I reviewed the book The Slaughter by Carol Case, and I even reached out to the NAACP and even an elected official in Mississippi to try to see if there's any other records available to discuss the 364th. And one of the things I found interesting was that the records that Carol Case brings up in his book were pretty much the same records that were brought up with the U.S. Army. So, and by that I mean if you read the book the Slaughter, the first few pages where they talk about the documentation, they all mention the events I mentioned before: the Phoenix Massacre, and the events that occurred from May 27th to May 30th and July 3rd. However, there was really no mention of a massacre, a large massacre of sorts occurring. With all that being said, however, knowing what I've read, both from firsthand accounts, records involving the U.S. Army and black soldiers in this time period, while there might not have been a massacre of 1,200 soldiers, there is something that doesn't add up about what occurred at Camp Van Dorn. And more specifically, my theory is more aligned with Malcolm Laplace's issue, where he says, okay, well, these soldiers were getting killed, but I was ordered to list them as AWOL. And the reason why I err on the Malcolm Laplace side of what was occurring is for a few reasons. Even though the U.S. Army did a report after Carol Case's book came out in 1998, the U.S. Army launched an investigation. I think the NAACP launched an investigation. And while ultimately all the records pretty much show that there wasn't a large-scale massacre, there was some records that were missing. And the U.S. Army explained it by saying, well, some of the records were destroyed in the 73 fire. Some of the personnel records were destroyed in the 1973 fire that occurred, and some of the unit records were destroyed immediately after World War II because the U.S. Army destroyed some of the records for units after World War II to make room for the regular Army's records. Now, some of that is true, but also another thing that leads me to believing Malcolm Laplace's explanation is actually some records I've read from other units. So there was an incident involving the 784th Tank Battalion, which is a unit I will cover later in the history series. There was an incident where 2 of their soldiers were killed by friendly fire when they first arrived in Europe. But in the records state that the soldiers were killed in action by enemy fire a few days after they were killed. And the only reason why we know that they actually died on New Year's Day rather than the date that was listed was because there was a few veterans who were alive from the 784th that mentioned that, hey, these guys were killed by friendly fire. And they remembered their names, and some of them even remember their soldiers number. So that's the first one. The second one that leads me to believe Malcolm Laplace's point was this book I read called Black Fire, The Making of American Revolutionary by Nelson Perry. And in the book, they make mention, both him and even other veterans of other black units in World War II make mention of how you had black soldiers who would go off post either to see their girlfriends or go into town, and the soldiers would not return. Some of them their bodies will be dumped right in front of the post, particularly in the southern areas. So I'm saying all this to say that my theory is that while there might not have been a massacre of 1,200 black soldiers at Camp Van Dorn, there might have been individual killings here and there of black soldiers who either went off post with their girl to visit women in the local community or to go into town. Those soldiers might have been killed either in quarrels with other soldiers, like what we would have seen in a soldier story, or they might have been killed by local racists who hated the fact that these black soldiers were there in the Deep South. There's a lot of things that could have happened, but I do believe that while there wasn't a massacre to the size of 1,200 black soldiers, I do believe that there were some black soldiers who were killed at Camp Van Dorn, and both the fact that they got killed as well as why they got killed were covered up. Now, by covered up, I don't mean where the U.S. Army did a grand scheme where they're like, oh, let's wipe this out. I mean where, like what Malcolm Laplace said, well, the commanding officer came and he said, well, these soldiers, I said they were killed in action. I said they were killed. No, they were listed as absent without leave. So, well, that is it for this video. I know it's probably a lengthy video, but hopefully I was able to provide some insight into Camp Van Dorn and the 364th Infantry. Now, again, like I said, with my theory, this is just based off of my theory as to what happened in terms of the Camp Van Dorn massacre. That's just based off my experiences with reading the first person account of black soldiers, as well as kind of cross referencing with records that would be available from those units. Now, with all that being said, I sincerely hope there's more records out there involving the 364th. I sincerely hope that, and in fact, if any of y'all watching this video, if y'all have any other records on the 364th, I would love for y'all to let me know so I can go back and update the video accordingly. But with all that said, the next video on the 364th will cover the investigation of these incidences, and like I said before in the Phoenix Massacre video, y'all will be very interested in how the U.S. Army actually investigated a lot of these occurrences. But with all that said, I want to thank you for taking time out to watch this video, and I'll see y'all next.